So today we are going to talk about CSS and learning cascading style sheet with Fixitgearware Security, and more of like a discussion on what you need to know in CSS. After this training today, you should be able to understand how to implement CSS when designing a website. And of course, structuring your CSS to look unique based on the nature of your project or the website you're designing for your clients. So let's get started. So before we talk about CSS, you need to understand three components when building a website for your clients. The first component you need to understand is the nature of the project or the website you're designing. So when we talk about the nature of the project, let's say, for example, you're designing a website for a clinical organization or a hospital, or you're designing a booking system for a hotel or reservation organization where people can register to reserve, relaxation spots or rooms for a specific country they intend to visit. So when you're designing this website, you should understand that the various designs for these two different organizations we just mentioned would definitely look different. So before you implement CSS on this various web application, you first of all have to understand the nature of the services this organization has to provide on their website. So for example, if you're designing for a clinical organization, does the platform has a section where users reserve appointments to see a doctor? Or does it have a section where users have to look up the names of doctors that are available for appointments? Or let's say, does it have a section where users have to check their medical histories and the various appointments they have had with that specific medical organization? So having considered those factors, that will give you an overview on how you can proceed to implement various cascading style sheet codes to make the website to be very unique. Now, the next stage we now have to talk about is the UI and UX. So when we talk about the UI, we want to talk about the user's interaction, the various tabs or sections of the website. When user interact with those various tabs or section, how does this website respond? Does it mean when the user click a link, it's going to open into a new tab? Does it mean when the user click a link, there will be a notification indicating that they are moving to another section of the website? These are part of the user's interaction. So for each segment or section of the website the user clicks, there should be some sort of, notification that will be replied to the user to let them know what they are proceeding or what next section of the website they are definitely, navigating to. Then we're not talking about the user's experience. So how does this fit in terms of the user's experience? We're talking the overview structure of the experience the user had interacting with this website. So were the fonts, the text, the information provided on this website very visible? Is it easy to understand? Can user be able to read the various texts or the various colors that were implemented in the various background sections of the website? So this, in a way, improve the user's zeal to come back to experience such services that this organization provides. So where the user has a very bad interaction with the website or do not have a satisfactory experience, that means the user will not, proceed further to visit that organization's website and of course use their services. Then finally, when we talk about CSS, we now have to consider other factors such as the mobile responsiveness. So when we talk about mobile responsiveness, we're talking about when the user visits the website on a mobile phone, how does it look like? When the user visits the website on an iPad, how does the view or the user's interface look like? Or let's say when the user visits the website on a laptop or computer that has a smaller screen, lesser than the standard computer screen, how does the viewer of this website looks like on the user's devices that the user is using to visit this various website. And now to understand these three structures and of course build a website that is very unique, this is where the CSS building blocks for web applications are very essential. So what are these building blocks? We're talking about the properties. We're talking about the inheritance. We're talking about writing CSS code that, avoids conflict in rows when cascading. And of course, predefined color codes. Now, when we talk about properties, what comes to your mind? Of course, when we talk about properties, we have to look into the text properties. We have to look in the list properties. We have to look in the tables properties. We have to look in the page media properties and others. So for example, when we talk about text, we want to talk about the text color. How do you want this color to look like? We talk about the direction of the text. Do you want it to be aligned left, right, or justified? Then we talk about the font weight. How strong do we want this weight to look like? We have a case whereby we want it to be extremely strong where the user has to see a very bold text. Now we talk about size. We talk about in pixels. Do you want it to be in 4 pixels, 6 pixels, 10 pixels, and so on? Then you talk about the font style. So when we talk about font style, we're talking about oblique, a normal text style, or do we want it to be in italic format? Then if we're talking about the list properties, we're talking about the list properties when we're dealing with other listing and another listing. So what is the list style position? How do you want it to be styled? What is the list style type you want to use? These properties are very essential because when you define these various properties on a website, the nature of your representation will determine how the user will feel when interacting with the various sections of your website. Then we move on to the tables properties. We talk about border collapse. So within border that exists in the table, do we want it to exist as one, or do we want to be separated? Now we talk about the border spacing. So what is the spacing we want the borders to have between various sections of the table? Then we talk about the caption site. So do you want the caption of the border to be at the top? Do you want it to be at the bottom? These are the things you have to understand. Then you talk about empty cells. So do you want empty cells to be visible or to be hidden? So without defining these properties uniquely in a very good way, this would also make the website to look awkward. Then when we talk about page media under the properties, we're talking about offense. So for offense, we want to talk about how many spacings from the bottom of the page when the user tries to print a text document from the website. So when we talk about the windows, we're talking about from the top, how many spacing from the top. So if these properties are not properly defined, this is going to cause a situation whereby, let's say the user's experience, of course, when the user interacts with this website, not to be unique. Then we talk about orders. When we talk about orders, we're talking about the cursors. So when the user hover cursor to a specific text, how do you want the cursor to look like? Do you want it to look like a unique star icon or hand gestures and so on? Then we move on to the quotes. So how are these quotes represented? Is it in block format? How they look like when the user, moves to that section of the CSS properties. Now, after defining these properties, the next thing we have to look at or talk about is inheritance. So when we talk about inheritance, we're talking about the whole properties that has to do with the various text defined within the body. So for example, when we define the body, like the body tags in a website, and we create a CSS property for the body, it means that every properties that the body represents will be inherited by the various tags within the body. So for example, in this code here, we have specified the CSS to have a font family of jumbo and calibrate. So whatever tags that exist within the body tags will inherit the same font family that was defined in the body properties. So this nature is called inheritance. So if we decide to define another properties within the body, code of the CSS. It means whatever text that sits within that body will inherit those properties within that text that is represented on the website. Now, there are cases whereby we want every text that are represented within the body to have a unique properties. This is where we have to now cascade to avoid conflicts. So when we cascade to avoid conflicts, how do we represent a unique properties for each of these tags that exist within the website or the web document? This is where the class and a class name is very unique. So for example, in this code here, we define two class names, Fixitgearware 1 and Fixitgearware 2. Now, if you look at this CSS code on the cascading to avoid conflicts, you can see that still these tags that exist in this HTML code will inherit the entire properties of the body. Whatever we have defined in the body properties of the CSS code will be inherited by these various tags. However, in the paragraph, we have specifically defined a color code. So this color code is something that has to do with the text that has the paragraph tags. So whatever, color code that was specified in the paragraph, every of those various paragraph that exists within the body will have the same unique color code. But let's say we want to now have additional properties for each paragraph separate from the entire paragraph that exists within the body tag of the HTML code. This is where we now have to now implement the class properties with the class properties name. So for Fixitgearware 1, we can now say .Fixitgearware1, and we now define a specific properties we want. In this case, we say the background color. So we are saying the background color to use the RGBA. And of course, 0.4 means that it has to be 60% faded. Now, for the class properties of Fixitgearware 2, we are saying that the background color should use a 25% faded. So even when the user or the visitor of this website goes to this, website, the font will still remain the same. The paragraph color will still remain the same, and of course the weight. But for each of the background color implemented for each paragraph, they will look distinctively unique because we have implemented a class with a class name that has a different properties in the background color. Now, having understand what cascading is to avoid conflict, let's now understand why predefined color codes are very important in CSS. So when we talk about predefined color codes, we're talking about using code by names or by color code numbers. Now, you should understand these two properties profoundly well, because when you are designing a website, let's say, for example, you want to use the color code of red in the first paragraph. So you can either use red as a name or the color code. Now, let's say we want to use a lighter red. You cannot use the name lighter red because in CSS properties, there's nothing like lighter red. This is where we now have to now implement the color codes. So we use online color pickers to adjust the properties of the red in the unique way we want it to exist. Then whatever color code that was generated, we can now use it to implement in our CSS properties. And once we implement it, it's going to reflect on the front end of the website, adopting those properties via the color code. So this is why it is very important to understand these four, structures of designing CSS. First of all, you have to understand the properties, how you want these properties to look like in terms of the text and criteria that are within these properties, then how they are inherited. So when we talk about inheritance, we want to understand how these properties are inherited. Should the properties that were defined in the parent tags be inherited in the entire, tags that are within the parent tags, or we want to define a unique way that each of these tags are represented by adopting the cascading concept to avoid conflicts. And of course, the predefined color codes that are needed for each representation we want to define within this CSS properties. So this is very unique that you understand this process, is because if you don't have a proper understanding of the properties, the inheritance, how to cascade to avoid conflict, and the predefined color codes, then you will have a problem where you have to design a website that doesn't look unique or a good user's experience or user's interaction. So this summarizes cascading style sheet. And hopefully with this short video and training we have just described today, you're able to understand CSS in a very unique way. And subsequently, when we start writing, basic HTML codes and implementing respective CSS properties, you'll be able to understand how this is very easy to understand. And of course, write a unique website from scratch without the need of using default templates or properties from templates engines that you downloaded online or from themes that you purchased to design a website. Thank you and see you next time. Bye for now.